We had both places, then we lost one of the places. Hey, we're good. Okay, welcome. Welcome to our fourth formation meeting of this year. And today we are presenting the history of the Springfield Dominican sisters. What we will do, we're going to open our meeting with the Dominican Associate Prayer, and if you were given one of those as we came in, and you may want to know in that second paragraph where it says Josephine Maher, she is responsible as being one of our founders, and so that's why her name is there. And so you may wonder who that is as we go through this prayer. So let us place ourselves in the presence of God and let us all pray. Gracious One, guide my footsteps along the path of your truth. Free me to preach your word. Fill me with the fire of your love. Show me the way of Dominican life. Lead me that I may journey with a heart full of peace, adoration, and thanksgiving, in the company of Dominic, Catherine of Siena, Rose of Lima, Josephine Maher, our Dominican sisters and our associates. Continue to transform my life and the lives of associates and sisters, that we might be preachers of your love, students of wisdom, bearers of the light of Christ to each person we encounter. Bless all peoples, bless our earth. Teach us to live, play, and work in harmony with all life. May we praise, bless, preach always, in all ways. Amen. Thank you. Okay. I hope all of you had a good month, and I think you will find the history of our community interesting if you have not or do not know of it, because it is very unusual. And today we have Sister Linda Tonelato. And after spending just 3 years with her favorite students, first and second graders, Sister Mary Linda taught art, English literature and composition, theology and scripture in high schools for over 20 years. She also taught scripture and theology in our formation program for 9 years. She was a pioneer at the Religious Education Office for the Diocese of Springfield, and later conducted parish scripture and theology classes for adults in various parishes. She served as pastoral associate for a year and preached on parable retreat teams before becoming the archivist for the congregation. After 17 years, you're probably trying to figure out her age by now. After 17 years as archivist, she's now the curator of the Heritage Room, which is the room across the hall here on first floor. Linda has a BA in art from St. Xavier College and an MA in secondary education from DePaul University. She has studied scripture and theology at Providence College, Rhode Island, and at Boston College, and has a preaching certificate from the Aquinas School of Theology in St. Louis. Let us welcome Sister Linda Tonelato.
She's a bit taller than I am. Well, if you've been figuring my age, I entered early, literally. And I just had a birthday, and 80's getting too close. Thank you, Sister Palmieri. I'm not sure I always recognize myself when she goes through that recital, and I add my welcome to hers. Now, I am assuming you've already heard the story about how the Dominican family started with St. Dominic, and something about the spirituality about the order of preachers. And so you know that the Springfield Dominicans are just a part of a very large and very old Dominican family. In fact, this year, the Dominican family is celebrating the 800th year of its existence. I think we look pretty good for our age. Today I'd like to tell you more about the family, more about the Springfield part of the family, since you're thinking of joining this part of the huge family. You're all sort of like people getting engaged. People who are planning to marry are really joining together, not just with one person, but with a whole other family. I suspect that those of you who are married learned that you had another family that came along with your husband or wife, and you learned it probably rather dramatically at certain points in your marriages. So before you make any commitment, it's a good idea to know something quite a bit about who it is you're joining, to know their family history. Now, as Sister Palmieri implied, our family story, especially at the beginning, is so intriguing, I could get carried away with stories. So I'm going to try to stick to this text to stay on track. And I'll use some pictures. If you can't see the screen very well from where you're sitting, just adjust where you are. And there'll be a short break about halfway through so you can move around a bit, etc. If you have any questions or comments, please just jot them down on the papers there, and we can talk about it afterwards. Any questions? And if you can't hear me, let me know. Okay. Since we Springfield Dominicans are a family like your families in many respects, we have family characteristics, no matter how different we may be as individuals in our own families of origin. So we, the Springfield Dominicans, were born 142 years ago in Jacksonville, Illinois. Yet no one knew it, least of all us. Nor did they, the first ones, the pioneers. And if that sounds strange, it was. And it's a story bound up with a mystery which has never been solved. I'd like to begin with that. And I can hear some of you thinking, why is she going so far back? I never did like history. Well, one writer says, the past isn't forgotten. It isn't even past. And if you've ever caught yourself quoting your mom to your kids or your students, you know what I mean. At a National Archivist Conference in 2009, Sister Barbara Beaumont, the sister historian of the Order of Preachers, said, the study of the past is a preparation for the future journey. The point of departure is as important as the destination. So what was our point of departure? How does our story begin? Well, like all good stories do. Once upon a time, really in 1872 or 73, in a town called Jacksonville in the state of Illinois, there was a small Catholic school staffed by lay teachers. It had been open only 1 year when the pastor, Father Mackin, bemoaned to his visiting priest cousin the sad situation. The laymen just couldn't handle those immigrant Irish children. And their methods involved harsh corporal punishment, which the pastor didn't approve of, but he didn't know what to do. Now, as Providence would have it, Father Mackin's cousin, John McShane, was a Dominican. He told the pastor about some Dominican sisters in Kentucky who taught boys, which was unusual in those days. He suggested that his cousin ask the bishop to see about getting some of those sisters from Kentucky for his school, which is what he did. So at Father Mackin's request, the bishop wrote to the Kentucky Dominican Mother General, Regina O'Mara, requesting teachers. Mother Regina responded affirmatively. Sometime in the summer, having received no further word from Illinois, Mother Regina reassigned those sisters who'd been selected to go to Illinois. Now, this lack of communication would have far-reaching results, as communication problems often do. It was the mid-August of 1973, and no sisters had arrived from Kentucky. So Father Mackin hurried there, well, as fast as you could hurry in 1873. And this was St. Catherine's in Kentucky. There he pleaded with Mother Regina. They had to have sister teachers. His firm conviction that the sisters could build trust and break down the barriers in Jacksonville, which was pretty ethnically torn at that time, was so persuasive that Mother Regina promised immediate action. I don't know where she found them, but quickly sisters were selected, not the original ones, but different sisters were selected for the Illinois missions. They weren't volunteers, nor were they simply appointed by Mother Regina, but by vote of the council and the chaplain. The sisters selected had only 48 hours to prepare to leave Kentucky for Illinois, which, less than 10 years after the Civil War and the home of President Lincoln, was like going to a strange, very foreign country. There was little time for explanations or goodbyes. And as you can imagine, that set the stage for later misunderstandings. In a reply to a question from Sister Rachel Conway, the oldest in the group, Mother Regina said that they could all return to Kentucky in 2 years. But she didn't mention to any of them the points she had included in the letter to Bishop Baltes: independence from Kentucky and opening of a novitiate. Her promise of their return in 2 years gave them courage and hope, but they were left totally unaware of the full reality of their situation. It was another and never to be explained communication breakdown. So off the pioneer sisters went, from south to north, courageously undertaking, as our constitutions say, what was to become a familiar pilgrimage, a move from a secure and beloved home to a new and unknown place of ministry. Led by the Spirit, in response to a call from the church through their religious community, they went to preach, not from a pulpit, but with their words and their lives. And I think most of you here know how to do that. You probably don't preach from a pulpit very often, but you surely do preach with your words and your lives all the time. So after a long and eventful train ride, they arrived, very hot and dusty, their long white wool habits covered by black mantles, on August 19th, 1873, at their new home. It was a little bit different from the one they had left in Kentucky. August 19, 1873. It was the birthday of our congregation, but nobody knew it but God. The 6 pioneers were Sister Rachel Conway, who was the oldest at 45. And that was rather old at that time. Josephine Maher, the superior, Mary Agnes McGuire, Ozana Powell, Alberta Rumpf, and Cecilia Carey, the youngest at 23. Most of them had an imposing Dominican lineage, and they had fascinating life stories already, but they faced an incredibly new beginning. There was an enthusiastic crowd of Jacksonville parishioners to welcome the arriving sisters. And although it was the height of a financial panic in 1873, and most of the parishioners were poor themselves, the sisters found a well-stocked kitchen and a furnished convent. And people soon came individually to welcome the sisters, and they all brought gifts from their gardens and their kitchens. These people reflected the faith and the self-sacrifice that has supported the parochial school system in the United States for decades. And curious non-Catholics peered through the shutters on a side porch while the sisters were at recreation, a practice that would last nearly all the first year. The sisters attempted neither to identify nor to dissuade the onlookers, and their neighbors' rather unscientific investigations of these strange-looking creatures and their lack of reaction seemed to have lessened the prejudice towards the sisters. And so those six began immediately what would become a heritage of ministry in education, music, and domestic service. But it was a future of which they were blissfully unaware. So in September 1873, St. Patrick's School, Jacksonville, opened for its second year. Now, if you've ever been tempted to bemoan your own situation in life, consider this. School opened that year with 400 ungraded students, ages 5 to 16, 4 classrooms, 4 teachers, and no records. Sister Josephine had outlined the program to be followed. When she did it, they just got there in mid-August. I can't imagine. In secular subjects, the St. Patrick students would use the same textbooks as their public school peers, and the text for religious education, as you can guess, was the Catechism. Creativity and ingenuity, coupled with experience, replaced corporal punishment as a means of maintaining discipline. The sisters were all experienced teachers, and they were just as convinced as the pastor that education could do 2 things. 1, free the children of immigrants from the stigma of poverty and their immigrant background, and 2, make them loyal Americans. They were even more certain that religious instructions and practice would make them staunch Catholics. And that's as true today as it was then. What of the other 2 sisters? There was Sister Rachel Conway, who taught music and played the organ at church. Her story was fascinating, but there's no time to tell it today. And the other sister was Sister Hosanna, who took care of the house and cooked. She hadn't been well when she left Kentucky, and by November she became so ill as a result of an unusually severe Illinois winter, which must have started early then, that Kentucky sent Sister Mary Thomas White, an experienced teacher, to the new mission. This was great. It enabled the sisters to open a 5th classroom and relieve the overcrowding. So, especially those of you who are teachers, you could imagine what a blessing that was. By December of that first year, Sister Hosanna reluctantly returned to Kentucky. She died there in March, having offered her life for the Illinois mission. It was the first great sorrow of the small community. The first summer came and it was idyllic. The sisters had time to plan classes, and they canned food for the coming year, and dreamed of their promised return to Kentucky next summer. These pioneers were both educators and practical women, and they were homesick. Their second year began with one of the most memorable events in the community's history. At the request of President U.S. Grant, with the permission of Bishop Baltes, Sister Mary Josephine and Sister Mary Rachel unveiled the statue of Abraham Lincoln on the occasion of the dedication of the Lincoln Monument at Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield, Illinois. Well, you know what the Lincoln Monument looks like. Well, how did it happen that the 2 sisters ended up doing that? Well, I'm glad you asked. President Grant had told the committee that was planning the dedication that he wanted two sisters there to unveil the statue of Lincoln, which was to crown the newly completed monument. Why two sisters the president would ask for? Anybody have any idea? Well, from Kentucky? No, it was to be a public expression of gratitude to all the nuns of the battlefield who had served during the Civil War as nurses. They had cared for the wounded. There they are. They had cared for the wounded during the Civil War, having ignored their own safety on battlefields. Well then, having learned on the night before the ceremony that since the only sisters in Springfield were cloistered Ursulines, and of course they couldn't do it, his request could not be met. The president and General Sherman were nonplussed. I mean, Sherman could win a war, but he couldn't get two sisters. Sherman, who remembered the devotion of the Kentucky Dominicans during the war, bellowed that they wouldn't fail him if only they were near. It just so happened that Father Mackin was present at the reception, and he heard Sherman. Probably half of Springfield heard Sherman. Father Mackin hastened to tell the president that he had Kentucky Dominicans at his school 30 miles away. Well, a wire from the president to the bishop, and a special train, and two pioneer sisters, Rachel and Josephine, unveiled the bronze image of Lincoln during the dedication of the monument. And then they promptly returned to Jacksonville to the respective classrooms. The event was strangely apropos. 4 of the pioneer sisters had themselves been war nurses in Kentucky. Among them, Sisters Josephine and Rachel, the two who did the unveiling. And another had done nurses wounded in Tennessee. That second winter, though, was even more severe than the one before. There was a severe blizzard and the poor living conditions in that little convent, and unpaid salaries led to extreme poverty, and extreme illnesses nearly crippled the young mission. Sisters Rachel and Alberta fell victim to spinal meningitis. Sister Josephine turned the school over to Sister Mary Agnes, who hired a lay teacher to assist her. And to help with the housework and cooking, Sister Josephine hired a girl they'd known in Kentucky. And Sister Josephine herself took care of the sick, a dangerous duty she wouldn't let anybody else perform. Dr. George Jones, a non-Catholic doctor in Jacksonville, who had treated Sister Ozana the year before, treated the sick sisters. He came daily, sometimes several times a daily, to check on them. In him, the sisters found a benefactor to whom they'd owe their very survival. He would also serve as their defender among the non-Catholics of the town. When the 2 sick sisters seemed to be dying, the other 3 spent the whole night in prayer before the Blessed Sacrament, praying for a miracle. And they got one. The sisters recovered, but not enough to return to teaching school. So Sister Josephine turned to Kentucky for help in the emergency, and then she herself fell violently ill. Dr. Jones kept almost continual watch over her. The sisters again stormed heaven, and Sister Josephine finally recovered, to the joy of the whole parish, and especially of Dr. Jones. He was later give almost 19 years of free medical care to the sisters. Meanwhile, Kentucky's response to the anguished plea from Jacksonville was to promptly send — how promptly could you send from Kentucky to Illinois? But as fast as they could, Sisters Catherine Young and Thomasina Simpson, not even finally professed, arrived. They were young and energetic. They would help keep the school going while the sisters recuperated. They were totally inexperienced, but they were healthy, young, and willing. Charles Rout, a church trustee and philanthropist, generously and discreetly relieved their financial plight. It was a service he would perform for the rest of his life. So great was Mr. Rout's help that I think in many senses he was a founder of our community. Without his generosity, our first sisters literally would not have survived. Yeah, right, Rout High School is named for him. In the spring, Father Mackin insisted that the sisters buy his spacious rectory. His remorse and concern for their dismal living conditions were part of the reasons for this. The other part was his puzzlement over why they hadn't done anything about establishing a novitiate, as if they hadn't had enough to do. He was totally unaware that they were totally unaware that this was expected of them. The sisters, though greatly puzzled, bought the rectory for $7,000, which they didn't have, so they thus incurred a huge debt. In June, they moved from their little cottage to their new home and named it St. Rose Convent. And its successor is across the parking lot, St. Rose North and St. Rose South, convents for the sisters at Sacred Heart Griffin, and one for the 5 members of our leadership team. To return to 1874 in Jacksonville, when school was out in June, the sisters began excitedly packing to go home to Kentucky, as Mother Regina had promised them. Initially puzzled by all the excited packing, Father Mackin finally informed them, to their great consternation and dismay, that St. Catherine's was no longer home to them, that they were independent of Kentucky, and they were to establish a novitiate immediately. So great was their disbelief that he went to Alton to obtain the letter from Mother Regina that detailed the arrangement made with Bishop Baltes. And each sister made a copy of the letter, which is how we know the contents. It's disappeared from the diocesan archives. The sudden call to leave Kentucky for the mission in the north had demanded a painful sacrifice, but this revelation was infinitely more painful for them. Why they knew nothing of their situation is a mystery that remains unsolved to this day, as is the mystery of why subsequent communication didn't clarify matters. While Father Mackin returned the letter to the bishop in Alton, the sisters, in bewildered grief, and then, true to their Dominican heritage, for an honest discussion about their plight, gathered together to pray. At the end of the day, they gave their common consent to the painful reality they found themselves in, and each sister freely signed her name to a contract that established them as a new foundation. They had resorted to him in order to accept their new reality. They turned their faces from a beloved past to a challenging future. They were secure only in their faith that the God who so mysteriously had called them from Kentucky would be with them on their way in Illinois. And aware now of their identity as the founding members of a new congregation whose convent suddenly had become a mother house, they began a novitiate. There were first 2 postulants from guess where? New York. Imagine that in the 1870s. Sister Josephine's brother, the Dominican provincial in New York City, had encouraged the 2 women to come. The 2 New Yorkers and 3 local young women formed the first novitiate. You can only imagine how their backgrounds meshed, or didn't. It would seem that the community story was beginning a somewhat rosier chapter, but that winter, a second wave of spinal meningitis felled 4 of the sisters, who were unable to return to school all year. Sister Mary Agnes, again with the help of Miss Healy, ran the school. And in May, the first reception and profession ceremonies were held in the parish church. Sister Thomasina pronounced her final vows and was promptly made mistress of novices. The 5 postulants received the habit. Interestingly, only the 2 from New York would stay, not the ones from the area. The next year, 1876, was still full of challenges. Poverty, debt, remember that $7,000 that they didn't have? And hunger and loneliness. The latter was the worst. They felt cut off from the old home. To dispel the coolness that developed between Kentucky and Illinois as a consequence of the recent separation, a letter records, Sister Josephine and Sister Cecilia went to Kentucky to effect a reconciliation if possible. I can't imagine how they made all these trips back and forth back in the 1870s. None of the other sisters in Jacksonville ever learned exactly what transpired on that visit. But thereafter, the accounts read that a great love for St. Catherine's was instilled in the hearts of new members. Somehow, over the years, this whole story was lost to the Kentucky Dominicans, and it came as a shocking and bewildering revelation to the Kentuckys in very recent years. We knew about it, but they didn't. Well, back to Jacksonville. 3 years later, in the spring of 1879, oh, that's Father Hickey. There he is. Father Timothy Hickey was appointed pastor of the Jacksonville parish. He was to become not only a benefactor, but also a lifelong friend and a spiritual director for the sisters. He would be instrumental in the sisters' move to Springfield, and later, as Vicar General of the diocese, he would be their strong supporter. At the same time, 2 German-speaking Precious Blood sisters from Ruma, Illinois, spent some months with the community studying English and music in preparation for opening an English-speaking school in Ruma. By August, they weren't fluent enough in English to run a school, not surprisingly, so Bishop Baltes asked the Dominicans to go to Ruma to assist them. Sisters Mary Thomas, Mary Catherine, and Magdalene went to Ruma, where they taught English to the sisters and ran the school. This they did for 5 years, until the sisters had finally learned enough English to teach. And this was a harbinger of events to come much later in the 20th century and the early 21st. Also, it was the community's first ministry outside of Jacksonville. Much later, we would return to meet the immigrant need for literacy by opening literacy centers in Aurora and Chicago. And I find it intriguing to see how many of our recent new ministries that we've engaged in are simply variations of some of our very earliest ones. In 1880, another pioneer, Sister Alberta Rumpf, returned to St. Catharines, Kentucky, 7 years after her arrival. She'd been one of the members of the Tennessee Dominican community prior to its devastation by yellow fever and its dissolution. But the rigors of Illinois weather, after her bouts with spinal meningitis, were sufficient to daunt even a veteran of Civil War nursing service. So itinerancy was certainly a mark of these sisters. In 1881, just 8 years after they had arrived in Jacksonville, the sisters opened St. Rose Academy in the larger rooms of St. Rose Convent in Jacksonville. It was just for girls, because the pastor thought that it was not yet time for boys to be included, as the sisters had wanted. It was the beginning of a ministry in secondary education, which continues to this day, 134 years later. Also that year, 4 sisters were sent to St. John's in Carrollton, their first parish grade school outside of Jacksonville, at the request of the pastor there. He'd heard about the sisters from his friend, the pastor in Lima. The sisters' reputation as educators was spreading, and they were asked to staff more schools. During the 12 years in which the sisters had lived in their rectory mother house, the community had grown from 8 to 28 members. By 1885, the St. Rose Convent was just too small for the number of sisters, and the number of academy students also there. So Mr. Rout took the sisters to investigate all possible sites for a new mother house. The Yates property next to the church, the home of the former governor, seemed ideal, but there was concern about taking on another huge debt. The council agreed to Mr. Rout's request as their business advisor that he be allowed to vote with the community about the new site. The vote was a unanimous yes. As you can guess, Mr. Rout managed to pay off the debt. When the necessary addition was completed in 1887 and the sisters moved into the Yates residence, their second mother house, it was their second move in 12 years made to accommodate the growth in numbers. It would be wonderful if we had that problem today. Now I think it's about time for a break. Well, before the break, we left the community in Jacksonville. How did they get here? Well, not quite as dramatically as they left Kentucky. But the series of events that led to the move to Springfield were very interesting and very human. So I have to tell that story. First, in 1889, Father Timothy Hickey, the sister's spiritual director and their staunch friend, was appointed Vicar General of the Alton Diocese and was transferred to Old St. Mary's in Springfield. The sisters grieved the loss of their beloved pastor, but would later see that providence was at work. The academy and the community continued to grow in numbers, so everybody agreed that another move was necessary. There was no room for expansion on their present site. However, the community was deeply divided over those who couldn't bear to leave Jacksonville and those who agreed with Sister Josephine that it was necessary to move to Springfield. It was the first major disagreement in the community, 16 years after their arrival. I think they did pretty well. While the debate about where to move continued, in May, Father Raymond Maher requested that his sister, Sister Josephine, accompany him to Ireland, where it was hoped he would recover from serious illness. The council agreed to his request. They also decided that during Sister Josephine's absence, each side of the debate should record their reasons for their choice of location, and they all pray about it. So Sister Josephine went off with her brother to Ireland, where he became deathly ill, but lived to return to the United States in August. And Mother Agnes obtained from Bishop Baltes permission for Sister Josephine to stay with her brother in Philadelphia until he died. This decision expressed gratitude to Father Maher, one of their great benefactors. It also provided for Sister Josephine a much-needed respite and a cooling-off period for the community controversy. The next year, in 1890, as Providence would have it, a significant move was made. 9 of the sisters began teaching 600 students at Old St. Mary's in Springfield. Why? Well, Father Hickey, the new pastor, wanted the boys and girls taught together, and the Notre Dame sisters, who already staffed the school, were unable to do that. So he had asked his Dominican friends in Jacksonville to come. Again, the sisters' willingness to teach boys, which had brought them to Jacksonville in the first place, was leading them to a new location, and this would be a recurring pattern in our story. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, back in Jacksonville, Sister Josephine asked that Mr. Rout and Father Hickey be consulted about a proposed plan for a chapel addition that the sisters in Jacksonville had come up with while she was in Ireland. Well, she wasn't Irish for nothing. As she expected, both of them pointed out the drawbacks and advocated the sisters' move to Springfield. The consultation with 2 benefactors and advisors had historic consequences. The council was finally convinced the Mother House should move to Springfield. Letters were sent to the community soliciting a vote on whether to move or stay. And in May of 1891, a tour of Springfield concluded with the selection of the Du Bois property. Back. There. That later became the Music Conservatory and the front of the Du Bois house. It was a 17-acre site on the west side of the city as a possible location for the move. The community voted unanimously to purchase it for the new Mother House location. Our good friend Mr. Rout lending us the money, say the acts of the council. It was another pattern that seems to be in our community genes. Our congregation doesn't make major decisions unless a major part of the family agrees, even if it takes a long time to reach that agreement, drives some of the community to distraction. And if some of you who've known us for a long time wondered why we seem slow to move on some subjects, now you know why. On June 5th, 1891, Father Hickey sent the sisters a typically laconic telegram to announce the transaction. Property bought, money paid, possession July 1st, period. A check to Lincoln Du Bois for $13,000 was signed by Mr. Rout, who immediately donated $1,000, and the rest being owed by the sisters. But you can guess what happened later. He canceled the entire debt. This property, as you know, would serve as the locus for the community's Mother House and other major buildings now into the 21st century. The sisters voted to call their new home in Springfield Convent of Our Lady of the Sacred Heart, because the purchase had occurred on the Feast of the Sacred Heart. They also accepted plans for a new convent, since the Du Bois house was not adequate to the needs of the community. Shortly after, construction began on that addition, and buildings have been going up and down on this piece of land ever since. A building erected in 1955 and used as first as an infirmary and then as a convent for the faculty of Sacred Heart Academy was rather recently torn down in a green fashion And when you drove in today, you can see what replaced it, the double convent I mentioned before, St. Rose North and St. Rose South. And there's a chapel in the center for both of them. To go back to our story, on June 9th, 1893, the Mother House community moved to Springfield, Illinois. There's a poignant entry in the council minutes. Jacksonville became a dependent mission. In the 20 years from their 1873 arrival in Jacksonville to their 1893 move to Springfield, the community had grown from 6 to 45 professed sisters. They were serving in 13 missions, 12 grade schools and 1 high school, and they had withdrawn from one and closed one. There were 5 novices and 4 postulants. From then on, the congregation would be popularly known as the Springfield Dominicans, although officially it's the Congregation of Our Lady of the Sacred Heart. The move to Springfield was followed by, you can guess, a festive celebration, a chapel blessing, and the celebration of Father Hickey's Silver Jubilee. I make a note of that because these festivities were the beginning of a long-standing community tradition of grand celebrations whenever there's a special event. The same year, 1893, although the community was heavily in debt, Mother Josephine sent $100 to New York Dominicans when their convent was destroyed by fire. The New York community thereafter prayed for the Springfield community as one of their greatest benefactors. So the community's perilous economic state didn't preclude their generosity and charity for another community. On August 30th, that same year, 1893, the feast of St. Rose of Lima, sisters were sent to St. Mary's School in East St. Louis. Whoops, well, that's a chapel. Oh, I seem to be having trouble with getting these in sequence. Well, does anyone know what East St. Louis meant those days? It was a black community, which was something new for the sisters. The numbers of the sisters had exceeded the needs of the Springfield diocese. Can you imagine it? And this new ministry would lead to a long ministry to black students. And it would be the harbinger, again, of events a century later that the sisters never could have dreamed of then. The next fall, Mother Thomasina was advised that some of the novitiate were talented in art. So, through St. Catherine's in Kentucky, she contacted one of their graduates, Alice Huber, who agreed to come to Springfield for a year to teach art. Not only was this a decision a significant effort to utilize the talents of the new members, but it was reflected the importance that art was given in the experience of the sisters from Kentucky, and that was to have far-reaching effects. Soon, novitiate advertising led to numerous requests that girls in the area be allowed to join the Dominican art class. Miss Huber accepted 7 from the city. Then girls from a distance wanted to be allowed to board at the convent, but Father Hickey refused permission till next year. Soon the art students made it clear that what they really wanted was a high school education. That November, 1894, Mr. Charles Rout died, and by his will, he freed the sisters from any obligations owed to him or his estate. Mr. Rout was one of the congregation's greatest benefactors, together with Father Hickey. Unlike most Dominican congregations in this country, who experienced painful situations with clergy, especially bishops in their beginning days, we were greatly blessed to have the significant support of the bishop and the clergy as well as of the laity. It literally made our survival possible. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here today. Both Mr. Rout and Mr. Hickey, laymen and clergymen, were integral parts of our founding community. Father Hickey, finally having given consent, September 1895, saw the opening of a second high school, the Academy of Our Lady of the Sacred Heart. It was located in the Du Bois building, and Sister Josephine was appointed mistress of the school. This academy, which many of you are somewhat familiar with, would become one of the community's major missions and the source of many vocations. As parents had asked, boarders were accepted and would be part of the school until the 1970s. Today, as you know, the academy has become co-ed, the sisters having again in 1989, at the bishop's request, accepted the boys from the nearby diocesan high school, and its name was changed to Sacred Heart Griffin High School. An interesting note, with Sacred Heart Academy well started and the art department in the hands of a sister that she had trained, Alice Huber left Springfield in January of 1896 for New York to resume her art studies. And there she met and joined with a woman, Rose Hawthorne Lathrop, and they together founded the Dominican Sisters for the Relief of Incurable Cancer. As Sister Mary Rose Huber, she maintained a lifelong friendship with Sister Mary Bernadine Irvine, who was an extraordinary music teacher at the Academy. Music was an integral part of the early days of the Academy and continues to be. And in 1897, the widowed sister of Charles Rout came to make her home with the sisters until her death. As they tried to repay her brother's generosity, they evidenced a spirit of compassion and hospitality that are among the community's most evident characteristics. 1898 marked the Silver Jubilee of the community and the Golden Jubilee of Sister Rachel Conway, the community's oldest member. In August, there were 70 professed sisters. That was an addition of 23 since they had moved from Jacksonville 5 years earlier. In the novitiate, there were 6 novices and 11 postulants. The debt on the mother house was completely liquidated just 5 years after its completion. In its first quarter century, the community had grown 12-fold, and the number of new members was almost triple the number of pioneers. The future was full of promise. The dark days were becoming memories. But we need to hang on to those memories. The turn of the century, the 20th that is, saw much that was new, not only in the nation, but also in the community. In the community, the council voted to erect a chapel building. In June, the cornerstone was laid. I don't know if you can read that. Sacred Heart Chapel, 1901. And in 1903, the chapel was dedicated. It remained in use. You can tell that's an old picture from those days. Until it was torn down in 1994. In 1904, 2 sisters were sent to Maine to teach English to French Dominicans who'd been expelled from France after the Revolution. The sisters had lots of practice in teaching English as a second language. The saddest event of the year was a fire that destroyed their old Kentucky home, St. Catherine's in Kentucky. Since the archives there were destroyed also, all hope of any future generations like us solving the mystery of the beginning days literally went up in smoke. Now, in the United States, there was much that was new, just as with the sisters there was. The turn of the century saw a new emphasis on secondary education, and this coincided with the growth of the academy and of the community who were in the same building. More space was needed again. And in 1905, the council voted to erect a new building for the academy. In 1910, the school was ready. Some of you may recognize the chapel building, the academy, and the convent. And there's the entrance to the academy. Some of us here went through that entrance. 1910 saw another new development. The sisters' teaching ministry, which had been mostly in rural areas, now moved to an urban one, Chicago. In 1910, the sisters went to St. Edward's and to Our Lady of Grace, the first of what would become a half-dozen Chicago schools. Also, their willingness to teach boys resulted in expanded ministry in the early years of that century. The sisters staffed nearly a dozen small high schools in parishes where they also taught in the grade schools. And to meet accrediting agency requirements, the sisters began attending summer school. The classes at Catholic University in Washington, D.C., and at DePaul in Chicago. There are a variety of the sisters at summer school. And this was the beginning of what would be a long-standing summer programs for sisters to get their degrees at universities that replaced long-standing community teacher education programs. By the end of its first half-century in 1923, the congregation had over 200 professed sisters, had 3 foundresses that were still living, taught in 36 missions in Illinois and beyond, and it was a reassuring growth, and it would continue, but it was paid for with the coin of patient suffering. By the 1930s, the early motif of dire poverty repeated itself. There were mortgage payments, sisters' college tuition, health care for the sick, all supported by inadequate salaries that often became non-existent during the Depression. Needs were reduced to a bare minimum. Habits were patched and repatched. As in the early years, Good Samaritans came to the rescue, and music lessons and piano lessons and summertime chicken dinners helped support the community. When finally, in 1941, all debts had been paid, a fund was established for the relief of those whose poverty was even bleaker than their own had been. Today in the archives, there's a file of requests and thank yous that come from 4 different continents, attesting to an ongoing sharing of gifts that would be formalized in the 1980s with the establishment of what is called the Poverty, Justice, and Peace Fund. Again, early way had led on to way. While the sisters struggled with the worst financial crisis since their foundation, membership grew, and they continued to respond to requests from other schools. And so they began teaching in another 30 schools. During those difficult years, the community had also responded to the call of the church through its bishops to meet new needs. In 1928, the expansion of their ministries beyond the classroom had begun. First, there were the children's social services in Peoria, then a convalescent home in Denver, and rural hospitals in Texas. Then, donning mission crosses, they headed for Jackson, Mississippi, where they took over an aging infirmary. Oops, too fast. That's the infirmary. And they never dreamed then that what it would become today, an enormous complex known as St. Dominic Jackson Health Services. and St. Catherine's Village, a multi-level retirement facility. In Jackson, they struggled for full integration in the hospital in Mississippi, long before the Civil Rights Movement. In Illinois, they opened a high school for the black students they'd been teaching in East St. Louis. Little did they foresee then that that route would lead to the community's leadership in the Springfield Project and the commitment of the 2005 General Chapter to begin the journey to becoming an anti-racist congregation. Their continuous ministry of religious education was expanded when they responded to the bishop's request that they staff 4 CCD centers in rural areas of the Springfield, Illinois diocese. Thus they became full-time itinerant preachers, bringing the good news of God's love to literally thousands in small parishes, and eventually educating the adults to become responsible for this ministry. During the same time, they built and staffed Marian Catholic High School, which for a long time was the only Catholic co-ed high school serving the Chicago Archdiocese, and Rosary High School for girls in Aurora, Illinois. In response to John the 23rd's call in 1961, they learned Spanish to speak God's word of truth and mercy in Peru. There, the preaching of their lives drew native Peruvians to seek to join them. And in 1897, a novitiate was opened in Lima. And 1997 saw final professions of the first Peruvian Springfield Dominicans. 60 years earlier, their beloved but crusty spiritual director, Father Hickey, had predicted, "You sisters will end up in the poor farm. Whenever you have an extra dollar in the bank, you'll either start another building or give it away." He was right. In mid-century, the community embarked on a path marked Build. Up went the bricks to provide for the needs of ministries and the community, now numbering nearly 400. 20 years of construction projects culminated in 1968 with a new mother house. Those of us who are old enough to lovingly remember the old mother house still call this the new mother house, although it's nearly half a century old. It's large enough to allow all the sisters to come home at the same time. Its imposing structure that was renovated between 1997 and 2000 and expanded for better care of the incapacitated is tangible witness to the community's deeply held value of community life and care for the infirm. And it's a witness also to God's providence. I think the place also looks pretty good for being as old as it is. The time to build, though, was paralleled by a time to tear down. The bricks of the old mother house, the old SHA, the old chapel gave way to new ones. And the faculty house, old St. Rose Convent, yielded its place to the new green St. Rose Convent, previously mentioned, that continues to witness to community commitment to common life. In response to the call of Vatican II, the congregation began to examine its roots, like you are, focusing first on revitalization of prayer and study, especially of Scripture and their Dominican heritage. Summers of renewal enhanced the yearly retreat, and a renewal center was established for ourselves and others. Our liturgical and musical heritages motivated the study and the practicing that enables nearly every house to sing the Liturgy of the Hours in choir. Ongoing community study and dialogue helped in the recovery of aspects of Dominican life that had become rather blurred over the years. As common life was examined, in the light of our heritage from Dominic and our founding sisters, we renewed our commitment to a simple lifestyle and to sharing gifts with the poor. Meanwhile, to meet new needs, ministries grew. In parishes, sisters became directors of religious education, liturgists, pastoral administrators, though today they have a new name, but I can never remember it. They were trying to figure out what it was the other day. But basically, you know what they are. The sisters who are in charge of a parish because there is no priest available except to occasionally have Mass. And they embraced Hispanic ministries and their African American brothers and sisters in literacy, which, as you may recall, they had started earlier in their lives, and in inner city programs. And they reached out to the marginated through teaching the deaf here and in Peru. They reached out through prison ministry and through advocacy and counseling for women and children. And as awareness of the plight of the earth grew, commitment to the care of creation, of the earth itself, was embodied in the documents and in the earth itself of Jubilee Farm. Yet these were but the branches of the same path of teaching and healing that had been embarked upon during the previous century. Though as numbers declined, there were fewer sisters in classrooms and hospitals. Those ministries flourished through lay involvement. And in the latter part of the 20th century, lay associates began joining the sisters on their journey. Till today, there are almost 400 laity sharing in that ministry. And when all the candidates make their commitments, that will be 29 more, correct? And there is Dorothy Coor, who is preaching as a lay preacher in the spirit of St. Dominic. One of the notable fruits of returning to Dominican roots has been the focus on the charism of preaching, including formal preaching, not just for priests. Sisters attended Aquinas Preaching Institute in St. Louis, established a telephone preaching line, and preached on parable retreat teams with other Dominican sisters and friars. Perhaps the sweetest fruit of these later years is a deepened awareness of our common heritage and the strengthening of bonds with other members of the Dominican family. In 1997, our general chapter issued a direction statement for the community, proclaiming inclusivity in relationships, an embrace of diversity, and a commitment to solidarity with the marginated. I hope you can see that that statement just made explicit what had been the implicit lived practice of the community for 125 years. Through its educational, healthcare, and pastoral ministries, it had reached out to, gone to immigrant Irish kids in Jacksonville, to Catholic boys whom other religions could not teach, and to rural Catholics without Catholic schools available, to Peruvians, and to new immigrants, especially Hispanics, to the deaf, to people in priestless parishes, all who are on the margin of society and often of the church. And it had deepened its own identity as part of the Dominican family of the Order of Preachers. And the years since then have been a continuation of focus on inclusivity, diversity, and solidarity with those on the margins of society, and also on the care of creation, and deepening and widening our bonds with other members of the Dominican family. Some examples of this are leadership in the Springfield Project, modeled on President Carter's Atlanta Project, to help poorer residents on the east side of the city improve the quality of their neighborhoods. One major way we participated in the project was buying and rehabbing a house on the east side for a convent, so the sisters could advocate with city government for the needs of area residents as homeowners there. Leading the effort to get the city to allow affordable housing to be built in various areas of the city and not just on the east side succeeded. And then leading the efforts that led to the establishment of a transitional living program for homeless teenage mothers and their children. Observing Jubilee year 2000 by canceling debts, all the debts that we were holding, and updating the wage scales for our Mother House employees from a just to a living wage, establishing endowment funds for our high schools and literacy centers in order to provide for scholarships and for faculty raises, and to ensure that these ministries would continue to serve people with financial needs, and purchasing a piece of land just outside of Springfield in order to preserve God's creation from urban sprawl. Okay. Now those are our Peruvian sisters, Iraqi sisters who studied with us. Well, Jubilee Farm, I think, will show up. It was there just a moment ago. The other way? I don't know. Can't seem to get these together today. The Jubilee Farm Center was and is a center for education in eco-spirituality. And Sister Sharon Zayak, director of the Jubilee Farm itself, was the first person to obtain a master's degree in earth spirituality. It's a new program at St. Mary of the Woods in Indiana. Inviting all the former members that we could locate to a homecoming celebration in 2000 turned out to be a really festive and a healing event. There it is. Any of you been to Jubilee Farm? If you haven't, you should make a trip. Fall is still beautiful there, and it's not far away. Some of the sisters who came home in 2000 were people who had come home for the first time since they had left the community. Other Dominicans from other countries have lived with us. Those are the sisters from other communities that celebrated with the Kentucky Dominicans at their 125th anniversary. Sisters from other communities lived with us and studied through our sponsorship, and they taught us a lot about other branches of our Dominican family tree and about the wider world beyond the confines of the United States. In 2000, there were sisters from Slovakia. In 2002, there are sisters Lima and Rehab from Mosul, Iraq. They came and they watched TV in disbelief as U.S. bombs rained down on their homeland. No, Sister Luma is presently in Jerusalem, where she teaches at the École Biblique, a renowned scripture study place. And so is Sister Mila from Peru, who is studying there. And you know what the situation is in Jerusalem now. So a few extra prayers for them as well as the other people there would be most welcome. To return to the United States and to Springfield, Dominican sisters came from Zambia. Then in 2004, Dominican sisters from Nigeria came and lived in one of our Chicago houses while studying there. And two of our sisters went to Cameroon. and they preached a retreat there. A Dominican from French-speaking Quebec in Canada has come to study here, and Sister Fausta, and a sister from Tanzania lived with us while studying English at Benedictine University, and she got lots of tutoring from some Dominican sisters here. Right now, she's on vacation from Benedictine University, where she has studied long and hard for her degree. Over the same years, the community has taken corporate stances. In 1994, our stance was for the implementation of scattered site housing all over the city, and in 1996, for the closing of the School of the Americas. In 1999, an end to the death penalty. 2000, to urge our government to stop the bombings and the sanctions in Iraq. And in 2003, we took a stance against the Iraq War. In 2004, the community called for a moratorium on planting GE crops. Until that is done, the labeling of GE crops, which has still not succeeded. In 2011, the community called for an end to all nuclear weapons and any other weapons of mass destruction. And in 2012, the community, conscious of the reality of the effects of climate change, we committed ourselves to trying in whatever ways we could to mitigate the effects. Also, in our continuing focus on inclusivity, diversity, and solidarity with those on the margins of society, on the care of creation, and of deepening and widening our bonds with other members of the Dominican family, we've done the following. In 2005, the former prioress of the Dominican Sisters in Iraq spoke here at a public meeting about the current war in her country. And the newly elected prioress from there visited us a short time later. And perhaps what may be one of the biggest steps in our history, in 2003, with the help of Crossroads, an interfaith ministry for racial justice, we began addressing the issue of racism and how to dismantle it. This led to a unanimous General Chapter decision in 2005 to embark on the road to becoming an anti-racist congregation. They tell us it's a 20-year process. Since then, over 3/4 of the sisters who are physically and mentally able have completed the initial step in anti-racist training by participating in a 2.5-day workshop. And hopefully, which includes the analysis of and leading to an understanding of racism. And our other sponsored institutions are doing the same. They're on the way. Some of them are advanced and some are just starting. In 2007, the congregation affirmed a mission statement that was explicated by commitments made at the 2005 General Chapter. And this is a mission statement that expresses who we were at that point in our history and who we continue to be, who the family is that you're seeking to join. It reads, Dominican Sisters of Springfield, Illinois, enriched by members from the United States and Peru, we firmly embrace vowed life in community. We are preachers in the spirit of Dominic, sustained by our life together and nourished by study, contemplation, and liturgical prayer. Come on. Moved by the woundedness of all creation, we compassionately preach the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Then, in 2009, our General Chapter built upon and amplified our earlier commitments and mission statement. the chapter delegates unanimously declared that because we reverence all creation as revelatory of God, we embrace as a moral imperative the need to help restore wholeness to a deeply wounded creation. I heard echoes of that in Pope Francis' recent encyclical, Laudato Si. And I recommend it if you haven't read it. It's one of the easiest encyclicals to read that I've ever read. There's a visible effect, a rather small one, but really visible around the mother house. There's a proliferation of recycling and compost containers all over the place. The chapter also declared that in light of the powerful impact the use of power has on people and their relationships, which the news shows us daily, we commit our resources and energies to promoting relationships that reflect gospel values and mutuality. The delegates also committed to study and deeper conversation regarding collaboration and relationships within the Dominican family. And some of you may know that this study and conversation has led to one visible, concrete effect. The 14 Dominican nuns. Now you have to make a distinction between the nuns, who are the contemplative women of the Dominican order, and the sisters, like us, who are in the active ministry. 14 nuns from Elmira, New York, are now living here. 2 of them in our infirmary, and the other 12 are living in Siena Hall, while they're planning the building of a new monastery in Girard, where they just purchased the land and have the plans for their monastery. And they hope that it will be finished in a couple of years. That's a high hope, so you can pray for that. And because of that, we now have in this space all 4 branches of the Dominican family together. There are the friars who live in their house you saw on the left as you came in, and then there are the nuns now living in Siena Hall, and the sisters here, and the laity and the associates. All branches of the Dominican order are within the same geographical region. It was a wish of the Dominican Master General, and it's finally been accomplished. Girard won't be that far away. The delegates at that last chapter also continued to believe, because of believing in the value of commitments that we have made, that we renew our commitment to invite new members. So maybe you'd join us in that. You can extend an invitation to anyone you think might be interested, and you can pray for that intention also. We have no idea how the next chapter of our history is going to evolve. But you will help write one of its chapters. And though we don't know what the future holds, together we can live into that future confidently, knowing whose hands hold that future. All of our futures. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister. Thank you for presenting our unique history, and I'm surely convinced really that all of us have a better understanding of the Springfield Dominican sisters. So thank you. We have a unique history. You have to admit that.